When I was 19, I inherited my grandparents' house when they passed away. It was built in the late 1800s and stood as one of the largest houses built in the state during that time. I quickly learned that it was a perfect house for throwing parties. It was tucked away behind acres of farmland, so the noise would never be an issue. I hosted a few parties prior to this one, and I soon became known around school as the guy who threw the best parties. School was about to start back up, and it was the perfect weekend for a party. The temperature had finally cooled off to a comfortable warmth after a long summer, and nobody had anything on the agenda in the weeks leading up to the semester. Since I had a massive backyard and plenty of space, I decided to throw together a last-minute party to enjoy the final nights of summer. Within the first hour of the party, I was greeted with a swarm of cars parked in front of my house. The music was blasting, and the people were having a great time. I couldn't have been more pleased. As the night went on, more people showed up, and I started worrying that some of these people weren't even invited. On top of that, the mass amount of people in my backyard actually made me concerned about the noise for the first time. Between the music, laughing, screaming, and talking, it sounded like a sold-out concert. I decided to ask my guests to tone it down a little bit, so that I wouldn't have to deal with any neighborhood complaints. Little did I know at the time, that wasn't the only sound that was going to disturb the peace that evening. At around 11 p.m., I noticed an old beat-up pickup truck parked outside my house. I watched from the side of the backyard as a male figure got out of the truck and started walking up to the front of the house. Not knowing if he was someone I invited, I ran around the side and met him at the front door, just as he was about to knock. As soon as I laid eyes on him, I knew I never invited him. He looked at me for a second, then said, "Who's the owner of this house?" I told him that I was, but as I said that, his expression grew more stern. "You need to send everyone home right now." I looked at him in confusion, but quickly realized he must have lived in one of the nearby houses and was upset about the noise. I told him I'll take care of everything, and he walked back to his truck. Not wanting to have to deal with the police, I started going around and telling people that they need to be more quiet again. But between the blasting music and drinking, my efforts went with no effect. That's when I started to get a little worried, realizing I had no control over the party I was hosting. Right when I was just about to tell people to leave, somebody started shooting off fireworks in the backyard, and that was the final straw for me. I started going around to people one by one and telling them that they had to leave. Several people who I'd never seen before were very rude about my request, making it extremely difficult. After maybe 30 minutes of trying, everyone was gone. When I went back inside, I noticed that both the lights upstairs and downstairs were all turned on, which I knew were not on earlier. I had left the doors to the house locked to make sure that no one would come inside at any given point, since my grandpa had built an outdoor bathroom on the side of the house. My heart sank as I realized that someone had definitely come inside my house. I couldn't figure out why though, because every single door was still locked. I started pacing around the rooms and checking for stolen items, but after frantically doing this for 10 minutes, nothing was missing. I started thinking how someone could have possibly gotten inside. Then it hit me. The garage door was left open, and the door leading inside was locked, but I left a spare key under the doormat in the garage. My heart started pounding as I raced to the garage to check for the spare key. When I flipped up the mat, I felt myself turn pale. It was gone. I honestly had no idea what to do. Out of the hundreds of people there, it was impossible to narrow down the culprit. Whoever it was still had my key, and I couldn't get a new lock overnight. I went to bed to get some sleep, but set my alarm clock so that I could get a new lock first thing in the morning. After tossing and turning for a while, I was able to pass out, mostly from the sheer exhaustion of the day. I went into a deep sleep until I was suddenly awakened to a loud noise that sounded like a bang. My eyes shot wide open, and I felt my fists clench as I thought about the garage door. My fear turned into a mix of anger, as I thought about someone really having the nerve to do this. I walked downstairs to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and made my way to the garage door. As soon as I approached it, I noticed that it was still locked. It didn't make any sense, unless the person was already inside, which made my fear overpower my anger. Realizing the person could be anywhere inside, I grabbed my keys to get out of there. As I was contemplating running out the door, I started to think about what I was doing. I woke up to what I thought was a loud bang, and instantly assumed the person with my spare key was back. I realized that they couldn't have gotten inside, especially since my garage door was closed and nobody knew the passcode. As I thought about it some more, It started to dawn on me that it could have been a dream, especially since I went to bed worrying about it. Now debating whether it was my paranoia or not, I looked outside the front window. There were no cars there, and the motion detecting lights were off. I felt a huge sense of relief, really starting to think that I made it up in my head. Just as a final precaution, I walked back to the double doors facing the backyard and looked outside. I didn't spot anything unusual until I caught something out of the corner of my eye that made me freeze. The doors going down to the old wine cellar were flipped open. Seeing that was enough for me to get into my car and call the police. I sat at the end of my street waiting for the cops to arrive. They searched my entire house top to bottom, and it was empty. As I started to feel a sense of relief hearing the news, an officer told me something that terrified me. In addition to the damaged lock on the cellar doors, my room was completely destroyed. My shelves in bed were kicked over, light bulbs were shattered, the closet was ransacked, and worst of all, there were knife imprints carved all over the walls. I felt myself shaking after hearing that, and I was definitely not going back for the rest of the night. Instead, I checked myself into a hotel and decided to handle the situation the next day. Within the next week, my dad and I had repaired the damages, swapped the locks, and added a security system to the house. The added protection helps me feel safer now, but the night still lingers in the back of my head every day. I still don't understand why someone would have done this, and I can't help but think about what would have happened if I was still sleeping when they got in. This happened to me during my first year of college, when I was attending Florida State University. Being that I was from out of state, I spent a lot of my freshman year trying to navigate through the new environment and make friends, since I had none going in. After a few weeks of starting my English class, I was befriended by a guy named Tyler. Tyler seemed friendly, and he really made an effort to get to know me. On the last day of finals, he invited me to a house party that night that he was hosting. He mentioned that he even invited a few of my newer friends that I met through school, and after realizing we had mutual friends, I was all in. Up until that point, I'd never been to a party before, and I was excited at the prospect of socializing with new people. During the hours leading up to the party, I was feeling a mix of both excitement and nervousness. He told me to come at 8, so I made sure I arrived at the address on time. As soon as I pulled up to his house, I noticed that there were only a couple other cars in the driveway. I got a bit worried that he gave me the wrong address, but I decided to ring the doorbell anyway, just to be sure. I waited in mild suspense, hoping that I got the right house. After a few seconds, I heard footsteps coming to the door, and it flew open. Tyler greeted me with a warm smile, and he welcomed me inside. I think he noticed the confused look on my face as I scanned the vacant living room, because he quickly said that everyone was downstairs. As he led me downstairs, I noticed that it was completely quiet. There was no music, talking, or anything. When I reached the bottom step of the stairway, I was met by 2 much older guys who I had never seen before. Tyler said they were his roommates, but they weren't in college anymore. I introduced myself, and also asked them if I came too early, since I definitely felt like I did. That's when one of Tyler's roommates spoke up, saying that there were more people on their way. As he said that, I instantly noticed that they were all acting a little nervous, but I kind of felt the same way, given the awkwardness of the situation. Suddenly, the 2 older guys turned and walked into the bathroom across the room and shut the door behind them, leaving me and Tyler alone in the room. The atmosphere felt tense and painfully awkward. After still just standing there, I started to get a feeling that something was off. After maybe 10 minutes, nobody else had showed up, and I was really starting to get scared. In a panic, I told Tyler that I had to go outside and call my friend really quick. Just as I turned around to head up the stairs, I felt Tyler grab me by the arm. That was when I completely lost it. What follows after this was a complete blur, but the little parts I can remember genuinely horrify me. Tyler threw me into a wall and started choking me, but I was able to hit him enough times to knock him off balance. I have absolutely no recollection of running up the stairs and getting to my car, but I did. For whatever reason, I didn't even think about calling the cops. Instead, I drove straight to the police station. After finally calming down and coming out of the shock, I gave them the address, and they immediately dispatched units to the house. Well, unsurprisingly, they were gone when the police showed up. I was assured by the officers that it was just a matter of time before they caught them. The next day, I received terrible news. The house had been up for sale for the past 2.5 months. This put the entire investigation at a dead end. Right after learning that, they searched the school records for a student named Tyler, fitting the description I gave them. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I learned that Tyler was never enrolled at FSU. Ever since that night, I've been diagnosed with PTSD and been going to therapy multiple times a week. Although I shouldn't think this way, I feel like it'll never get better until those 3 people are caught. Tyler's plan was extremely elaborate and well planned out. When I asked my friends that Tyler claimed to know, they all had no idea who he was. He must have found them through my followers on Instagram. I was a target, and he clearly wasn't alone in the planning. I still live with the anxiety each and every day, knowing they're out there somewhere. I was looking forward to a great night. The air was filled with anticipation, and I was excited to get to my friend's high school house party after homecoming. I went with a group of my friends who all had dates, but I was the only one going solo. My boyfriend broke up with me the week prior, accusing me of cheating when I was nothing but loyal. He had some anger issues and trust problems, so it was probably the best for us to split up anyway. As soon as the dance ended, my friends and I piled into a car and drove to the party. Right when I got inside, I was greeted with the pulsing sound of music that I could feel in the bones of my feet. Most of the people weren't even there yet, so the majority of the house was filled with red Solo cups and food. Being the only girls here at this point made us somewhat feel out of place, but everyone welcomed us with beaming smiles and hugs. Once more people started showing, I noticed that a few of my friends had gathered outside on the porch, so I made my way over to join them. We chatted aimlessly about the boringness of the dance and other random stuff. Soon enough, it was time to really get the party going. Most of the people were on the first floor, dancing around and playing Pong. There were also a few people in the basement, playing video games and listening to their own music. At some point, my friend and I ran upstairs to use the bathroom and talk about a few people who were annoying us. Suddenly, while we were in there, the lights went out, making the entire room pitch black. We froze, realizing the music had just been shut off as well. Everything was completely silent for a second, until I started to hear hushed conversations about people talking about a power outage. I dragged my hands against the wall until I felt the door handle, and we made our way back down in the darkness. After the initial shock had worn off, the party began to thin out, since the entire house was completely dark. My friends and I were just about to follow suit, but before I could reach the front door, I heard a girl screaming at the top of her lungs. It sounded like it had come from the basement, and a few guys went downstairs to investigate. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something wasn't right. Seconds later, we heard someone yell, "Call 911." I stood at the top of the stairs looking down to the basement, and I could see the flashlight beams of people's phones darting around the walls. I was with a group of 6 or 7 people, and we all decided to go downstairs and see what happened. I tried to silence my steps, but the floorboards creaked with every step we took. As soon as I got to the bottom, my heart raced as I saw a girl laying on the floor with a stab wound. Several of my friends were trying to put pressure on it to control the bleeding, but she seemed to be unconscious. Everyone was talking at the same time, making it impossible to make anything out. We didn't know who stabbed her, and we certainly didn't want to find out. My friends and I ran back up the stairs and out the door to the car. Right when we made it outside, I saw someone standing in the driveway staring at us, but we didn't take any time to see who it was. We sprinted as fast as we could to the car. As soon as I opened the door, I heard a familiar voice shout my name, immediately sending shivers down my back. It was my ex-boyfriend. He had a look of insanity on his face, and he was holding a sharp object in his hand. My friend floored it out of there and we drove back to her house, where we locked ourselves inside and sobbed. Once I got myself together, I called the police and told them that I think my ex-boyfriend just stabbed someone at a party. They had already sent units to the house, and sure enough, he was found hiding behind a bush on the side of the house. He was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning. It turns out, he was the one who stabbed the girl. When asked why, he told the police that he thought it was me. Hearing that made me break down into tears, realizing everything that he did was because of me, and I should have been the victim. Thankfully, the girl who was stabbed was treated and made a full recovery. Instead of facing jail time, he was sent to a maximum security psych ward after pleading insanity. His goal wasn't just to kill me, but to make it as terrifying as possible. He completely destroyed the electrical panel to the house, making it more likely for him to not be seen and get away. I'm disgusted that he wasn't put in jail, but I'm just glad he's off the streets. It was late July when I was hanging out with my friend and a couple of our other friends at his house for the night. We were having a campfire in his backyard, drinking some beer. My friend has a 2-year-old golden retriever named Steve, who just so happens to share the name of his owner, Steve. Anyway, Steve, the dog, was hanging out with us as we sat around and talked. Steve always likes playing fetch, so I was throwing his frisbee across the ridiculously big backyard. The grass extended back about 75 yards, where there was a strip of woods in between the houses on the other street. So, as I was playing fetch with Steve, he started barking like crazy in the direction of the house behind the woods. He wouldn't listen to us, but rather stood there, growling, snarling, and barking at seemingly nothing. After a couple of minutes, Steve came back to us with his frisbee like normal, almost like he completely forgot about what he was barking at in the first place. It was definitely out of character for him, given that we'd never heard him bark once in our lives. We sort of forgot about it, going back to talking about whatever it was we were talking about before. A few minutes later, Steve, the owner, stopped what he was saying in the middle of his sentence and stared towards the woods. We all turned back and looked in confusion, but I found nothing out of the ordinary. That's when Steve told us that the house behind his was abandoned. That got me thinking. There was a faint, yellow light shining through the window of the first floor that was definitely not on previously. He went on to explain that the house was recently damaged in a fire, and the family moved out afterward. We were spooked, but definitely interested, and since there were 4 of us, we decided to finish off our beers and check it out. We're pretty big guys, and could definitely fend for ourselves, but Steve brought his BB gun just in case, so we made our way through the woods to the backyard of the house. As we walked closer to the back door, I noticed that the house had an in-ground pool. The water looked dark green and muggy, definitely giving off the impression that no one lived there. We quietly tried the back door, but it was locked. We made our way around to the front of the house, checking to make sure there weren't any neighbors watching, then tried the door handle on the front door. It was unlocked. Steve stepped inside first, pointing his BB gun, as we closely followed behind. The first impression I got of the inside was creepy to say the least. Many of the walls were black after being burnt by the fire. A couple of the windows were shattered, either from the fire itself or intruders. But again, we were also technically intruders. Parts of the floor were burnt to a crisp, so we had to be extra cautious of where we were stepping. There was no furniture in what seemed to be the living room area, but everything was still faintly illuminated from the light in the other room. As soon as I stepped in the room with the light, I can now make out that it was the kitchen. The source of the light was coming from a flashlight, but it was sitting inside of the sink. It was definitely weird, but that wasn't what freaked me out the most. The window was in perfect view of Steve's backyard, so whoever put that flashlight there definitely would have been able to see us sitting around the fire. It was almost like they purposely left the flashlight, knowing we'd be able to see. That's when Steve had a brilliant idea of checking out the basement, which was definitely not what I wanted to do, especially after just coming to that realization. He opened the burnt basement door, and I pulled out my iPhone flashlight to see what was down there. Everything was completely burnt to a crisp, and the stairs were definitely not functional. It doesn't take a fireman to know that the source of the fire started in the basement. Relieved, I closed the door and followed Steve as we all walked up the seemingly undamaged stairs to the upper level of the house. At the top, everything was in perfect condition, so the fire must have been put out before it reached the second floor. I started to realize that the decrepit house was once a really nice home to a family. There were 5 rooms upstairs, and it actually had a similar layout to Steve's. As we checked the first room, everything was totally quiet, until we heard something that caught us off guard. There was music coming from one of the other rooms. It wasn't loud at all, but definitely loud enough for us to all hear. Steve stormed out of the room as the rest of us followed, as we tried to narrow down the source of the sound. It was coming from the last hallway on the left, but the door was closed. Steve opened it anyway, yelling, "Who's there?" pointing his BB gun. But after scanning the room, nothing was there, except for a Bluetooth speaker, sitting on the floor in the middle of the room.
The one spot we hadn't checked was the closet. Certain that we'd find someone inside, we started yelling for the person to come out. However, the door never moved, so that was our cue to open it up ourselves. As the door ripped open, I was shocked to find out that it was completely empty. The build-up to opening that door was enough to freak us out, so we made our way for the stairs to leave. As soon as we got out of the house, we looked at each other in disbelief as we made our way around towards the backyard to go home. I kept looking behind us, seeing the flashlight light up the kitchen through the window. I turned back around, confused and definitely a little creeped out. That's when my other friend turned to us. "Dude, someone's looking out the window on the second floor." I turned, completely shocked that he wasn't just messing with us. There was a silhouette of a person staring at us, in the same room we found the speaker. Steve suggested we should go back, but none of us were up for that, so we continued through the woods back to his house. It almost felt like whoever was inside that house purposely lured us out there. They had a clear view of us the whole time, and definitely would have saw us coming in the first place. I'm not sure why the person hid from us. Maybe it was just to scare us, or maybe they didn't expect there to be 4 of us. Our only guess is that the person hid in the attic when they saw us coming, since we had pretty much checked everywhere except for the attic. But again, that's just speculation. I'm not sure if anything would have turned out different if there had only been 2 of us, but I'm glad I'll never have to find out. When I was a kid, I grew up by a pretty popular amusement park called Geauga Lake in Aurora, Ohio. My family would always take me there, and we always had a great time. Even when I got into high school, my friends and I would often go up there to hang out on the weekends. Unfortunately, once other amusement parks like Cedar Point and Kings Island opened, they forced Geauga Lake out of business. What once stood as a life-filled amusement park was now a creepy, untouched ghost town. 2 of my friends and I still lived in the area, so we decided to get together and check it out. We got there around 10 p.m., since we'd be less likely to get caught in the dark. After crawling through a fence that was already cut out by other people to get in, we made our way around to the entrance area of the park where we'd be more familiar. Once we reached that point, we stopped and took everything in, reminiscing the good old days. It was sad to see the place so dead and lifeless, but at the same time, it was also a little creepy. Tall grass had grown through several parts of the park, windows were shattered, buildings were covered in graffiti, and saddest of all, our favorite spot that we hung out in under a huge tree had fallen down. Nonetheless, we were happy to be back at the place that we spent so much time in as kids. We tried a few doors to some of the old buildings, but most were locked, and we didn't feel like crawling through the glass in the broken windows to get inside. As we kept exploring, we found our favorite restaurant, which just so happened to be unlocked. Once we got in, I was sad to see the overall deterioration of the restaurant we once spent so much time in, but it felt good to be back to see it one last time. After hanging out in the one booth that wasn't completely destroyed, we ventured to check out the old rides. Some of them were already demolished, but the few that remained were in terrible condition, dark, and ominous looking. They were rusted and overgrown with vines, and the old concession stands were falling apart. We started making our way back to the front, and decided to stop into the restaurant one last time. As I was looking out the window, I realized that the old building across from us was an old ice cream shop, so I went over to see if it was unlocked, since it wasn't one of the buildings we checked. When I turned the door handle, it fell off the door, but somebody had broken the lock, so it opened right up. Surprised, I ran back across to the restaurant and told my friends that we could go inside. They were checking out the kitchen area and said they'd go look at it in a few minutes. I made my way back to the booth, remembering all the times I stood in front of the building with my parents to get ice cream as a kid. Anyway, I guess I sort of zoned out in thought and blankly stared at the table in front of me. Suddenly, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Somebody was standing in the window of the ice cream shop, staring at me. It took me a second to adjust my eyes, but I realized that it was someone dressed up in a panda costume. He was just standing there, obviously not expecting anyone else to be here, especially someone in a costume. I was freaked out. I got up and ran back into the kitchen where my friends were, and told them to look out the window. When I first told them, they didn't believe me, until they saw it for themselves. "Guys, isn't that one of the old mascots?" I looked at my friend as he said that, and I completely realized what he was talking about. Geauga Lake had 4 mascots: a monkey, a lion, a dog, and a panda. They would always be at the front of the park greeting people as they'd walk in. As the 3 of us stared back at this panda, it started waving at us. That was enough for us to get the hell out of there. We tried to act normal as we started walking back to the entrance, where we'd still have to find where we came in. As soon as we reached the front area of the entrance, I turned back around, and there it was, standing in the middle of the walkway in between the buildings. That's when I started running, and my friends followed suit when they realized why. We eventually found the hole in the fence, where we continued running to the car. Once we were maybe halfway in the grass field to the car, I turned around one last time, and it was there, standing behind the fence, waving at us. Now, as to why someone would be alone, wearing a panda costume, standing in an abandoned amusement park in the middle of the night is beyond my comprehension. We haven't been back since, and especially after that, we're not planning on it. When I was in high school, I was really into photography. My dream was to get hired as a photojournalist by a major media company, so I was up to doing just about anything to get some good pictures. One night, I went to an abandoned psych ward to grab a few nighttime pictures from there. The place had been closed down for about 3 years, but after talking to my friend who'd already explored there, he offered to go with me. I met him at his house, and he drove us there. The old psych ward was scheduled to be demolished within the next month, so I wanted to capture some memories of the building that was once inhabited by so many people before it became a pile of debris. The building was notorious for being haunted, but neither myself or my friend really believed in the paranormal. When we arrived, we parked the car in front of the house that was a couple blocks down from the building to avoid being spotted when the police did their nighttime patrols. My friend led the way, and I followed behind, very excited, but also a little nervous. As we walked along the fence towards the building, I noticed that the building definitely had an eerie vibe to it. It was a giant mass of darkness standing in the middle of the night, and no one but ourselves knew where we were. Once we reached a certain point, my friend and I hopped the fence and began walking across the grass to the emergency side door entrance that was supposedly unlocked. I really didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, but as soon as the creaky door swung open, I was blasted with damp and musty air as we walked inside. It reeked of urine and bleach, and it stung our nostrils. We flipped on our flashlights and began walking down the long and dark hallway. The building was not in great shape by any means, with holes all over the walls and floors, in addition to the hanging wires from the ceiling. I took a few pictures of the first floor wing and a couple of the other rooms, and even found some old drawings from what I assumed to be the patients from the psych ward. It was definitely a really creepy place, but we were having a great time. We even found the old elevator that was totally destroyed on the inside, but it made for some great shots. Shortly after, we found the stairwell that would lead to the basement, and although hesitant, we went down. Now, I really wasn't scared on the first floor, but the basement was really creepy. Everything was pitch black, and it seemed like our flashlights weren't even able to illuminate more than a few feet ahead of us. As we slowly made our way down one side of the hallway, we found a room that was labeled Boiler Room. I tried the door handle, and after a little pushing, I got it to open. Inside were ancient-looking mechanical machines that I'd never seen before. There were also several boxes along the wall of what looked to be old electrical equipment, but the wires were all ripped apart and hanging. After a couple pictures, we made our way down to the next room, labeled Storage. Inside were old hospital beds with leather straps coming out of the sides of the cart. It was exactly what I imagined. Some of the straps had teeth marks in them, and parts of the cart were badly scratched or broken, making me wonder what really happened to it. It was a pretty chilling sight, until we were interrupted by a loud crash from somewhere in the basement. We both froze, trying to hone in on where the sound came from, but it was impossible to tell from the empty hallways that echoed with the sound of anything. My friend walked out of the room with his flashlight and yelled, "Hello?" I tensed up as we waited for a response, wishing he hadn't said anything in the first place. That's when I really started to get scared, so I ran out into the hallway next to him and told him I wanted to leave. He wasn't opposed, because unless something huge just randomly fell on its own, we weren't alone. Then, out of nowhere, we heard another noise again. This time, it sounded like a bunch of metal tools had been knocked over, and we were able to tell which end of the hallway it came from, and we pointed our flashlights down the hallway. With the darkness engulfing the beam of the light, it wasn't much help. Suddenly, I was able to hear footsteps around the other end of the building, and unless it was my imagination, it sounded like they were getting closer. Without much time to stand around, we made our way up the stairs to the first floor. As soon as we started heading towards the exit at the end of the hallway, I heard a loud growling sound coming directly below us. I don't know how to put it, but it sounded like a loud grunt of frustration. We eventually got back to his car, and with our hearts pounding, we were speechless. I don't know who was down there that night, and I'm glad I never found out. I was relieved to get home, but that all changed when I woke up the next morning. As I was just about to walk out the door, I walked past my dad and said bye as he was watching the news. When I looked at the TV, I completely froze in my steps. The headline of the news was that the old psych ward was burned down last night, just hours after we left. Obviously not wanting to tell my dad I was just there, I walked out of the door and left for school, in total disbelief. Although I got some great pictures that night, it still deeply disturbs me that someone was down there with us the entire time, and we were oblivious to it all. It could be a crazy coincidence, but deep down, I know it wasn't.
I've been a semi-truck driver for 9 years, and during that time, I've seen some crazy things that most people wouldn't believe. But you know what they say, nothing can prepare you for the future. I found that out the hard way on a cold December evening. I had been driving all day, from Seattle, Washington to Boise, Idaho. This was one of my regular routes, and it felt like the miles just flew by. But near the end of my shift, I felt the exhaustion creeping in, and I decided to pull into a rest stop near the Snake River Canyon just off the I-84 freeway. I never took any chances with rest stops, so I parked my rig at the far end of the parking lot, making sure there were plenty of other vehicles between mine and any potential hazards. I put the parking brakes on, grabbed my flashlight, and hopped out of the cab to make my way toward the rest stop bathrooms. As I was walking, I noticed a woman standing in the shadows on the edge of the parking lot. She looked disheveled and frantic, and it was clear that something was wrong. I assumed that she was just a homeless person that had taken shelter for the night, but as I got closer, she rushed forward towards me. "Please," she pleaded, "I need your help. My husband just called in and he's been having chest pains. I need to get to the hospital." The look of fear in her eyes was enough to make my blood run cold. I hesitated, but I could tell the woman was desperate, and I couldn't just abandon her and leave her stranded. I reluctantly agreed, and we climbed into the cab of my truck. I asked her a few questions to get some information about her husband and his condition. She said her name was Claire, and her husband's name was Eric. She added that he was also having trouble breathing and was complaining of dizziness. He told her it was getting worse by the minute, so we had to get there quickly. We drove in silence as my mind was spinning. I navigated the winding roads and made my way toward the hospital. I had a million questions running through my head, but now wasn't the time to ask them. Finally, when we reached the hospital, I pulled up to the emergency room drop-off zone. Before I could say anything, she was already out of the door and sprinting towards the entrance. I put the truck in park and got out to follow her. My heart was pounding so hard. When I reached the entrance, she was nowhere to be seen. I frantically searched the lobby and the hallway, but there was no sign of her. I asked the lady at the reception desk if she saw where she went, and she led me to the room. When we got to the hallway, I spotted Claire slouched on the ground against the wall. Eric was dead. After a few moments of silence, I finally mustered the courage to ask Claire what had happened, but she was too grief-stricken to answer. I offered to drive her back to the rest stop, but all she mumbled was, "No, I want to go home with Eric." I was heartbroken to hear that, and ended up convincing Claire to let me drive her back to the rest stop, despite her utter shock. When we were almost there, I finally worked up the courage to ask her more about what happened before I showed up. Everything she was saying sounded absolutely devastating, until she broke down and confessed something horrible to me. In tears, she said, "We had a terrible argument earlier, and I slipped something into his drink." My mouth dropped open in shock, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We drove the rest of the way in silence, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine. When we finally arrived at the rest stop, Claire got out and slowly walked away. I watched her as she disappeared back into the rest stop. After collecting myself and taking a few deep breaths, I called the police. I guess I learned a pretty tough lesson that night. No matter how much experience you have in life, you never know what the future can hold. It had been nearly 12 years since I had taken over the family freight company. As November settled, it was really starting to feel like winter. The sun was setting earlier and earlier, and the temperature was steadily dropping. Little did I know, the darkest of days were still to come. It was around 9 p.m. on a Wednesday, and I was just about ready to close up shop for the night when I heard my cell phone vibrate. I glanced at the caller ID and noticed it was one of my drivers, Pat. He usually stayed out late on the roads delivering goods, but this call was odd. He's been with me for 7 years and has not once called me outside of our routine check-ins. I answered the phone, instantly noticing the panic in his heavy voice. He said he was being followed. Immediately, my heart dropped and my stomach churned. I didn't understand how he could be so sure someone was following him. I didn't want to doubt him though, given that he's always been extremely reliable and reasonable. Pat didn't give any more information. All he said after that was that he was scared and needed help. There wasn't much I could do in that situation, so I told him to get off the highway and call the police. I told him to drive somewhere where other people were around so he wouldn't be completely alone. He kept asking me questions, but I had no idea how to answer them. All I said was to keep the cab doors locked and to call me back once he was safe. I waited anxiously for him to call back, but the minutes felt like hours. After what felt like an eternity, Pat finally called back, but he sounded different this time. He said he had pulled over at a rest stop off the side of the highway and was safe. I asked him if he could see anyone around, but he said it was too dark and said that he got worked up over nothing. I felt bad for him, obviously sensing the embarrassment in his voice. A small part of me also felt like there was a chance he could be in real danger. He'd been working a lot of overtime and was probably exhausted, which made it unsafe for him to be on the road. Since he wasn't far, I told him to stay put and that I was coming to pick him up. I also gave him a list of nearby towns and roads, so he could move in case he was in danger. I also informed him to call the police with any sighting of suspicious activity, just to be safe. I sprang into action and started driving towards Pat. I had mapped out the quickest route to the rest stop, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. As I drove, I noticed how lifeless the highway had become. There were no headlights in sight, just me and the road. After about 30 minutes, I finally arrived at the rest stop. I drove to the entrance, only to find Pat's truck abandoned on the side of the road, maybe 50 yards ahead of the rest stop. The doors were left wide open, and the headlights were still on. My heart sank, and I bolted out of my car towards the truck. He was gone. I literally felt like I was living in a nightmare. I desperately screamed his name, but the expected silent response brought tears to my eyes. I called the police, trying my best to form proper sentences, but they knew exactly what I was talking about when they heard me mention Pat's name. He had already called just minutes before and told him that a car had been following him for the past hour and it just pulled into an abandoned rest stop where he was parked. The dispatcher told him to drive away, and he did, before he began screaming out of fear. Between his screams of terror, his last words were, "I'm gonna die," and then the phone hung up. Forensics searched the cab for any fingerprints or foul play, but it was completely clean. My heart goes out to his wife and baby boy, who will most likely never see or speak to him again. The guilt I feel each and every day is immeasurable. Had I just driven a bit faster, or left a minute sooner, I may have been able to save him from his awful fate. And to my dear friend, Pat, whether you're dead or alive, I hope you're in a better place and at peace. It had been a long night. I'd just finished my drop-off in Nebraska. However, this was only the halfway point. I still had to drive all the way back to Minnesota, and I was hoping to be home by the morning. But then, almost out of nowhere, the snow started. After just listening to the forecast earlier, it took me by surprise. It didn't take long for the lightly falling snow to turn into full-out blizzard conditions. I saw other vehicles driving in the opposite direction start to pull over, so I decided it was foolish to continue for much longer. I eventually stopped in South Dakota, just off the interstate near Rockerville. My truck started making weird noises, so I pulled over onto the side of the road, hugging the shoulder as tightly as possible so I wouldn't get hit by another car. Now, I'm no rookie trucker. I'm 36 now, and I've been doing this since I was 22. In the case of something happening like this, I stocked my trailer with extra supplies. I got out of the cab, instantly being blasted in the face by the tornado of snow, and quickly retrieved a few blankets and some other small supplies before getting back into the cab. I switched my CB radio on, hoping to hear something that might give me a bit of information on the weather, but all I got was static. I was starting to get a bit concerned, so I popped the hood of the truck to take a look at the engine. I quickly discovered the problem. The fan belt was snapped in two. I figured my best bet would be to call for a tow truck to come and grab me, so I quickly searched up a phone number. I sat in the cab, shivering from the freezing wind, waiting for what felt like forever for the tow truck to come. I tried to keep warm with the blankets, but it wasn't much help. It seemed like the snowfall only got heavier and the wind got colder. I had been in this situation before, once, but it hadn't felt as bad as this time. I switched the radio on once more, but this time, I heard something besides static. It sounded like a voice, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I cursed under my breath, frustrated and annoyed at the entirety of the situation. It was only then, in the painfully bright moonlight, that I noticed something in the trees next to me. I thought I saw something moving, but I couldn't make out what it was, as it was nearly impossible to see with the snow whirling around. Whoever it was seemed to be holding something to their face. I was pretty startled by this, not expecting to see someone emerge out of the woods in seemingly the middle of nowhere. I had no idea what to make of it, so I cracked the door open and said, "Hey, you alright?" The person gave no response, which was instantly a red flag. I called again, but to the same effect. I closed the door and shuddered, as I started feeling more and more panicked. Suddenly, the person started walking towards my truck. I could now make out that it looked like a fully grown man. As soon as he reached the tree line, he stopped moving. Now that he was just feet away, I was able to see that the object he was holding was a walkie-talkie. As soon as he put it to his face, I realized that he'd been causing the static noise all along. The strong gusts of wind were blowing into the microphone, causing the sound I thought to be static. That's when the noise turned into something that still freaks me out thinking about today. The guy started laughing over the radio. It wasn't a normal laugh, though. It sounded manic. That's when I realized that my life very well could be in danger, and I had no way of escaping. In a panic, I stumbled to the back of the cab and ripped open my toolkit, where I grabbed a small wrench. It wasn't much of a help, but if it came down to it, it was better than nothing. I pulled back the curtain and sat in the back of the cab, only preparing to come out if I heard him trying to get in. I reached for my phone to call the police. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, my phone died. Since my truck wouldn't start, I had no way of recharging it. A feeling of dread washed over me, realizing that my only hope was the tow truck driver, who may not even arrive for another hour. I was reminded that I left the CB radio on in the front when I heard the manic laughing start up again. It was non-stop, and every passing second felt like torture. Suddenly, after what felt like forever, it stopped. 1 minute went by, then 2, and I finally started feeling a little bit relieved, thinking that the man left. That all changed when I heard the door handle to the cab wiggling around. Sweat immediately formed on my forehead, despite the freezing temperature, and the adrenaline started hitting me, realizing that I may be seconds away from fighting for my life. Then the sound stopped, which was shortly followed by a loud bang. It sounded like he was kicking the door, and I knew that the lock wouldn't hold if he tried long enough. That's when I heard it. It was the sound of a vehicle. I was on my feet in an instant. I pulled back the curtain and made my way towards the front of the cab, hoping to see the tow truck, and thankfully, it was. As soon as the man saw him, he took off into the woods running. Not caring about the fierce winds and the snow torturing my eyes and skin, I got out of the cab and ran straight towards the tow truck. I was relieved beyond words. I thanked him as I jumped into the truck. I was finally being saved from the situation where I thought I was going to die. Well, we both made it out safe. It turns out, the man in the woods was beating my cab with a stone. He had bashed the door handle multiple times, and the mechanic said that he was probably one blow away from breaking the lock. It truly was the most terrifying and gut-wrenching night of my life, and if that tow truck company never answered when I called, there's a good chance I wouldn't be telling this story today. Last winter, I was driving on a solo cross-country trip to a family reunion. I was supposed to make it to my friend's house, but I encountered some horrible weather. There was a massive snowstorm, which caused major traffic. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, a terrible car accident happened right in front of me, so I was stuck for quite a while. By the time I got out of the traffic, I was already 5 hours behind schedule. I was exhausted. I knew I wouldn't make it driving through the night, so I pulled into a little strip motel. I hadn't used the restroom for the entire day, and my situation was pretty urgent. The motel was obviously small and noticeably dirty, but it would work in a pinch. As I parked my car, I noticed that there was a man staring at me through the check-in window. When I walked in, I noticed that there was also a college-aged woman in the room with him too. As soon as she saw me, she asked if I was traveling alone. It kind of took me by surprise, but I nodded my head and said I was. Up until this point, the man hadn't said a word, which I thought to be strange as well. When I went to hand him my ID and credit card, he made it clear that they'd only accept cash. Red flags were going off at this point, but I was desperate and it was my only option, so I scrounged together just enough cash and he tossed me the key. As soon as I stepped inside the room, I noticed that it looked super dirty and run down. It didn't take much time to look around and rush straight into the bathroom. When I got out, I flipped up the mattress to check for bed bugs, and sure enough, there were. It really grossed me out, and I already knew I was in for quite a night. A moment later, I spotted a cockroach that emerged from underneath the bed. If the bedbugs weren't the last straw, the cockroach was. I was out of there in a heartbeat. I decided I would use the parking space at the very least, and sleep in the back trunk hatch of my SUV. I curled up, using my suitcase as a pillow and random clothes for a blanket, and quickly fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of someone talking outside. I groggily rubbed my eyes and glanced out to see that it was the guy from check-in. He was on the phone. I looked at my watch, wondering what time it was. It was 3 a.m. It seemed a little weird, but it quickly got worse. As soon as he finished up his call, I watched as he quietly walked over to my room, unlocked the door, and walked in. The lights didn't turn on, and I sat there, completely frozen in fear and shocked. After a minute or two, he came back out, but this time, he was accompanied by another man. The second guy slammed the door shut behind him and began cursing, all while I watched in disbelief. I never saw the second guy enter, and I don't even like to think about where he was before that. They angrily talked for a moment, before the check-in guy walked over to my SUV. My heart started racing, and I dropped down, quickly covering up my head with the shirt. After he tried the locked door, he peered in through the back seat, but between my tinted windows and me blending into the general mess, he didn't notice me in the hatch. The two guys walked away to the far side of the lot, as I watched the one point across the street to where a diner was. While they were distracted, I climbed up to the front seat and started my car, taking my only chance I had to get out of there. As soon as they heard my engine revving out of the parking lot, they had a look of disbelief on their faces. That adrenaline rush lasted me for the entire trip, and I drove straight there without stopping at all. Once morning came around, I called my friends back home and told them, but didn't want to worry my family, so I never mentioned anything to them. When I got back home 3 weeks later, we figured out the name of the motel thanks to Google Maps and called the police. The response left me speechless when they told me the place had closed down only days before I called. As crazy as it might sound, the bedbugs and cockroach saved my life that night. I was working the night shift at the Red Road Motel, located off of a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. It was a small, run-down establishment with only 10 rooms, but it was the only place for miles for travelers to stay. I had been working at the motel for about a year and had grown used to the monotony of my shift. But on this particular night, it was completely different. It was about 11 p.m., and I was sitting behind the front desk, watching the heavily falling snow outside. I stared at the window in a daze until the phone rang, snapping me out of my trance. I answered, but there was no one on the other end. After saying hello several times, I assumed that there was bad reception and hung up. Immediately after hanging up, the phone rang again. This time, there was a man on the line. He introduced himself as a repairman who was being sent by the owner of the motel to fix the vending machine in the lobby. I was skeptical, as the owner had never mentioned anything about a repairman coming, but the man was insistent and said he was just a few minutes away. I agreed to let him in, and a few minutes later, a tall, burly man entered the lobby, carrying a toolbox. He introduced himself as Mike and went straight to work on the vending machine. I watched him for a few minutes while we chatted, before returning to my desk to continue my shift. Everything was quiet for a while, until I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from one of the rooms. I jumped out of my chair, wondering what could have caused such a disturbance. I cautiously approached the door of the room from where the scream had come from and listened. I heard shuffling and the sound of someone crying. I knocked on the door and asked if everything was okay, but there was no response. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should call the police, but at the same time, I didn't want to overreact. I decided to try the door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, but the bathroom door was closed. I approached it slowly and pushed it open. To my horror, I saw a young woman, with tears streaming down her face, huddled in the corner. That's when the shower curtain ripped open and the repairman attacked me, telling me that I shouldn't have come inside. For crazy situations like these, I always keep a switchblade in my pocket. While he was on top of me punching me in the face, I pulled it out and pointed it at him. Thankfully, the knife was enough to deter the attack, and he took off and ran straight towards the parking lot. With blood dripping from my face, I turned and asked her if she was okay, but she wouldn't speak. She just kept repeating the same phrase over and over again. "He's going to kill me." I quickly called the police, and within minutes, they arrived at the motel. They searched the room and the surrounding area, but he was gone. The police questioned the woman, but she was too frightened to say much, only repeating the same phrase over and over again. They eventually took her to the hospital for evaluation, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. It wasn't until the next morning that the truth began to unravel. The police informed me that the woman was the wife of Mike, who was claiming to be the repairman. He was pulled over and arrested shortly after leaving the motel. After searching his car, the police found 10 gallons of gasoline and a large bundle of rope, which were both in the bed of his extended cab truck. Mike's wife had managed to escape their house after Mike beat her. She ran to the motel for the night to escape from him until he calmed down. When Mike arrived at the motel and found her there, he was most likely planning on doing something horrific to her. As the days passed, I couldn't help but think about the events of that night and how things could have turned out differently if I hadn't been carrying a knife. It was a terrifying and eye-opening experience, and definitely one that I will never forget. His trial is still ongoing, but I can only hope that they put him away for a long time. As I drove closer to my destination, there was a feeling of dread looming over me. I had visited my mom in the nursing home a few times already, but knowing that this would likely be the last time put an extra bit of weight in my heart. I was so lost in thought that I didn't realize how exhausted I had become until it was too late. I had to stop for the night. I found an old motel off the highway and sighed in relief when I pulled into the parking lot. It was just past 10 p.m., and by this point, I was desperate for a good night's rest. I grabbed my duffel bag, locked up my car, and made my way inside the building. The lobby was relatively modern, considering the building's age, but it seemed a bit strange. The exterior appearance looked extremely run down, with rotting wood and chipping paint, but the inside looked like a much nicer, completely different place. After checking in, the clerk gave me a room key to room 117, and I thanked him as I rushed to my room to get to bed. I opened the door and quietly closed it behind me, hoping that the noise wouldn't wake up anyone else in the motel. I flipped on the light and took a second to draw a breath. The room was incredibly clean, and the bed was surprisingly comfortable. I tossed my bag on the floor of the closet and lay down on the bed, desperate for rest and relaxation. I turned on the TV and began to adjust to the peaceful background noise. Before I knew it, I had passed out. I woke several hours later to an eerie silence. I thought about my mom and instantly started feeling upset, which caused my mind to race. I laid there for what felt like forever, trying to take my mind off of it, but it was too upsetting. I started thinking about the driving I'd have to do in a few hours, which led me to think about the game plan for the next day. I hadn't showered in over a day, and I realized that I left my bag with all the toiletries I had packed in my car. Since I was fully awake and knew I wouldn't be falling back asleep anytime soon, I decided to take a shower, so I got up to walk to my car that was parked on the side of the motel. As I made my way down the long hallway, I noticed that the lights were now flickering, which started to correlate with the eeriness of the building's exterior. Once I reached the exit and opened the door, I heard a strange noise coming from the adjacent room. It sounded like a muffled crying. I paused for a moment and then cautiously turned around and slowly crept towards the source of the sound. I initially tried to avoid the creaking floor, but unfortunately, the motel did not seem to have floors that were much better in quality. I was definitely a little concerned, so I put my ear to the door. As soon as I did, the crying stopped. I waited a minute, and it was still silent, so I made my way out of the exit and to my car. While I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling of worry I had inside of me. Something really felt off about that room, and the entire encounter put me on edge. I retrieved my bag and walked back, and what I saw when I walked back in froze me in my steps. The door to the room was wide open, but all the lights were off inside. I peeked my head in, asking if everything was alright, but I got no response. The TV was flickering, and it provided just enough light to make out certain shapes in the room. That's when I saw it. A figure was hunched over in the corner furthest away from the door. I was already freaked out, but seeing that made everything feel 10 times worse. I asked if they were alright again, but like before, I got no response. Now that I already involved myself in the situation, I flipped on the lights to get a better look. It was a woman. As I got closer, I saw that a pillow was right next to her, covered in what seemed to be saliva. It didn't look like she was breathing, and I felt my stomach sink. Horrified, I reached in my pocket for my phone to call the police, but I realized I left it in my room. I frantically ran out of the room to the front desk, where I told the clerk. The police arrived and ended up searching the entire motel for clues. They weren't positive yet, but they speculated that someone suffocated her with the pillow. If I had stepped inside when I first heard her, that person may be alive today, but on the other hand, I very well could have been killed too. As soon as I finished up talking to the police, I got out of there and never looked back. Thankfully, I eventually learned that the killer was caught and was sentenced to life in prison. I still can't help but feel the shame and regret in myself, knowing that I might have been able to make a difference, and ultimately chose not to.
I used to work as a park ranger in Chiricahua National Park in Arizona. My job was pretty boring, but I was used to the lonely hours of darkness, spent patrolling the winding roads throughout the park. A lot of my friends would always say I was brave for always being out in the desolate wilderness alone at night, but to me, it really wasn't that scary. I guess it's something that a lot of people would prefer not to do, but something about the untouched beauty of the night drew me into it. This night started off no different. I was at my post chatting over the radio with my partner Paul, who was wrapping up at the visitor center. I remember specifically talking to him on the radio about our favorite spots we've each found on our shifts, and the ones we still wanted to explore. We had each already done our nightly safety check, and now I was about to pick him up for our leisurely cruise around the park. Then, Paul yawned and said he had to go use the restroom. "I'll be back in a few minutes," he said as he put down the radio. I got in my car to go pick him up for our patrol, which was about 5 minutes away. His post was at the visitor center, which had the cleanest bathrooms, so I was planning on following suit before we set out. When I arrived at the center, I saw that Paul wasn't outside waiting for me yet, so I got out of my truck and headed towards the bathrooms. I opened up the door, expecting to see Paul's feet in the stall, but the room was empty. I assumed he must have ran back inside, so I did my business and went back out to my truck. When I opened the door, I grabbed the radio and said, "I'm outside, let's get going," but there was no response. I waited a few minutes before getting up and grabbing the building keys to go get him inside. When I got in the building, I searched all around, but he was nowhere to be found. That's when I started getting a little panicked, since this was very unlikely of him. Just then, My boss from the station radioed in, asking if we left yet. I quickly radioed back to the station and told him that I couldn't find Paul. He started asking me a ton of questions, but I couldn't answer any of them. I had no idea where he was. All I said was to get here as soon as possible. I kept radioing in for Paul, but he still wasn't responding. I ran outside and yelled his name in the parking lot, completely losing my voice from all the screaming. I was completely beside myself. I eventually looked at my watch, seeing that it was already past 11 and there was still no word from Paul. When my boss arrived, he became even more worried after seeing the look on my face. He went inside and accessed the security camera footage facing the bathrooms, and I waited in total suspense as he scrolled through the feed. Suddenly, he caught Paul on the camera walking out to the bathroom at 10:32 p.m. That's when he let the feed run at normal speed. A couple minutes later, Paul walked out of the bathroom and took a few steps toward the visitor center, before he stopped and turned around towards the woods behind the bathroom facility, using his flashlight. My heart began to race as my eyes stayed glued on the CCTV screen. The following seconds showed Paul walking into the woods, looking side to side, then disappearing as he walked deeper into the woods. My boss kept the feed running as I continued radioing into Paul, hoping for a response. The police showed up and searched the area he disappeared in, but stopped after the first hour, saying that it was too dark and they weren't properly prepared. Search and rescue teams showed up at sunrise the next morning, and they searched for the next several days, but nobody ever found him. Well, none of us ever heard from Paul again, and whatever happened to him is still unknown. When I was 11 and my older cousin was 13, we'd often go exploring in the Cuyahoga County National Park. It was conveniently located right by my house. The distance was short enough to walk there, and on many occasions, we'd spend a good majority of the day there exploring the woods. One time though, in particular, didn't turn out as planned. It was early spring, and the snow that was covering the woods for the past several months was finally beginning to melt. We decided to set out for a day-long adventure, and maybe find a new hangout spot in the process. We were pretty familiar with most of the area by my house, given that we'd practically been going there ever since we could walk. Like usual, we entered in through the woods that led us to a towpath that stretched for miles and miles ahead. We walked that path until it branched off into a hiking trail, which we'd take for another mile or so, before reaching some park benches, where we'd usually take a break and hang out. Once we reached that point, my cousin suggested that we should take the trail even further, then find a new hangout spot. I agreed, and we continued walking down the trail. We ended up walking deeper into the woods than we ever had at that point, and I was starting to get a little bit nervous that we'd get lost. My cousin reassured me though, explaining that all we had to do was follow the trail the opposite direction to get back. We walked for miles, and each of us were in a bit of a daze as we sort of zoned out on the hike. As we continued on, we each noticed something that we'd never seen before. Through the barren trees, tucked off to the side of the trail, was a wooden cabin. It definitely looked eerie, being that it was seemingly in the middle of nowhere, but again, we were in the national park. They had little cabins all over the area for people to rent out. By the looks of it, it seemed abandoned, and my cousin really wanted to check it out. Although a little frightened, I followed behind as he approached it. We crept around it, wondering how someone would even find this to rent out. As we reached the backside of the cabin, I noticed another trail that must have led to a parking lot. We were both pretty excited at the sight of our new discovery, and our curiosity continued to grow. We started looking into the windows, seeing that the inside of the cabin looked extremely nice. From what I could see, there was a couch, TV, fireplace, and even a bunk bed in another room. Seeing that was enough to draw me in even more, and out of curiosity, we tried the front door to see if it was unlocked. As soon as my cousin turned the door handle, we both looked at each other in disbelief as the door creaked open. Although the door was now partially opened, I decided to knock, just in case someone was staying there. But after trying a few times, it was obvious that it was empty. Someone must have forgotten to lock it when they left, but we were quite happy they did. The inside of the cabin was beautiful, and I threw myself onto the bunk bed, thankful that I had it to rest on, instead of the wooden park benches miles back. My cousin opened the fridge and yelled for me to check it out when he looked at me with pure excitement. I rolled out of bed and walked to the fridge to see that it was fully stocked with tons of food. Although we were definitely snooping, we didn't want to steal or be any more intrusive than we already were, so we closed it up and kept exploring the inside. More time passed, and by that point, we were kicked back on the couch watching some TV, resting up to make our return back home. Right when we were about to leave, my cousin suggested that we'd at least drink some water before going, since we hadn't had any all day. I was definitely dehydrated, so we made our way into the kitchen. Not wanting to leave a trace, I turned on the faucet and drank from it like a water fountain, then went back in the living room to turn off the TV. As my cousin was drinking in the kitchen, he frantically spun around and said, "Someone's coming." My stomach dropped, and I crept into the kitchen to see what he was talking about. Sure enough, there was a man walking down the trail coming directly towards the cabin. As soon as I saw him, I completely regretted it, because I made direct eye contact with him. I watched in total fear as he started running towards us, and we instantly turned around and bolted for the front door. By the time we reached the door and opened it, he was standing right there. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a plaid shirt, jeans, and beige boots. Despite the mean look on his face, he kindly said, "What are you guys doing here?" I was speechless, but my cousin mustered up the words to answer. We were just exploring. I'm sorry, we'll go now." He chuckled and said, "No worries. You guys are more than welcome to stay here and hang out." My cousin and I looked at each other, and I said, "Thank you, but we should get going now. Sorry again." I'd always been taught not to talk to strangers, but in this situation, I didn't really have a choice. I wasn't too worried yet because he initially came off as a nice person, but that all changed when he spoke again. "You guys really shouldn't be leaving this late. It's gonna be dark soon. Why don't you guys just stay here for the night?" My cousin and I weren't the smartest, but we definitely weren't idiots. Every red flag we'd been taught as kids were going off in our heads, and we knew we needed to leave right away, but this guy was blocking the only exit we had. Without saying anything else, he took a step forward into the cabin, closing and locking the door behind him. I was terrified and knew we were in a dangerous situation. He sat us down on the couch and flipped on the TV before sitting down right next to us on a chair. I could feel myself shaking, but tried my hardest not to look nervous on the outside. After several torturous minutes, he got up and started walking towards the bathroom, mentioning that it was time to go to bed soon, as he gestured toward the master bedroom. As soon as he walked into the bathroom, he started peeing, all while leaving the door wide open so he'd have a clear view of us. I looked at my cousin out of the corner of my eye, trying not to make it too obvious. At that point, I knew we had the same idea. Without saying anything, we both shot up off the couch and made a beeline to the door. He obviously saw this and started yelling at us to stop, but before he could even make it out of the bathroom, we were already out the door. We went straight to the trail we came from and sprinted faster than we ever had in our entire lives. I turned around to see him just standing by the door, but that didn't stop us from getting the hell out of there. Our adrenaline carried each of us far enough to the towpath, and by then, the guy was out of sight. We didn't stop once and made it straight back to my house, where my parents were waiting inside, mad that we were home this late. Neither of us told our parents about our encounter, worried that we'd get in trouble for breaking into the cabin. I don't know what that guy's exact intentions were, but the older I get, the more obvious it is to me. My cousin and I narrowly escaped a situation that could have significantly altered the course of our lives, and we've never seen that creep since. When I was a child, my dad would always take me camping with him, and I always remembered loving it. However, ever since he passed away when I was little, I hadn't been camping since I was probably 12 or 13, so on this weekend, my dreams of camping again had finally become a reality. My husband of 8 years had just left me, and I was back to living in a one-bedroom studio apartment. I needed an escape, a fresh start. I was headed to the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee for a weekend of alone time, away from the old life I was so desperate to leave. I arrived at the park on a Friday evening. As I pulled into the vast, wooded grounds, I already felt a substantial difference in the air. Everything seemed calmer and much more peaceful. I found my campsite and began unloading my gear and supplies before the darkness of the night set in. Once I started to settle in, I decided to make myself something to eat. I made a small fire and cooked up some instant ramen noodles. When I finished, I felt comfortable and soon became tired, so I lowered the fire and made my way to my tent. I zipped my tent shut and crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted from all the driving. As I was laying there with my thoughts racing, I heard a noise. I stopped and strained my ears. It almost sounded like something stepped on a twig. I jumped up and made my way to the tent flap. I scanned the area around me, but since the fire wasn't providing much light, it was mostly just darkness. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and thought about the noise, realizing that it was probably just an animal or wood popping in the fire. I laughed at myself, not expecting to get this scared at the slightest sound. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling much better than the night before. I made breakfast, had some coffee, and began to explore the area. I hiked for what felt like hours, all while feeling a sense of happiness, which was something I hadn't felt in a long time. As the day wore on, I swam in the river, and while I cooled off, I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching me. I kept hearing footsteps, but again, I assumed it was just an animal and that I was freaking myself out. After dinner, I wandered around a bit longer, taking in all the sights and sounds of everything. I was growing used to the sounds that once sounded so foreign to me. My worries faded away, and I stopped feeling so on edge. The next morning, I made some breakfast and prepared to go visit a really cool waterfall. I had mapped out a hiking route that was about 10 miles away. Going into this, I had overestimated my endurance. Once I reached mile 5, I was already beat, and I had to keep taking breaks. With each mile after that, I grew more and more tired. There were a lot of hills, and I was walking on an incline for most of the way after that. I was determined though, and ended up trudging my way along to the waterfall. After about 3.5 hours, I finally made it there. The sight was beautiful, and I ended up staying there for a few hours, just admiring the scenery. I had packed a lot of food and water with me, knowing I'd probably hang out there for a while. Once 4 o'clock rolled around, I decided to start the trek back so I'd make it back to my campsite before dark. I was going at a much better pace this time, enjoying the slight decline on the first few miles. I was feeling better about myself already, knowing that I really needed this. As the sun started to set, my positive mood shifted into a worried one when I realized how dark it was already getting. The trees were starting to look more and more like shadows, so I picked up the pace, starting to panic a little. Thankfully, I reached my last landmark, and I knew my campsite was just a few hundred feet away. As I reached the clearing out of the woods and to my tent, I noticed that my tent zipper was open. I was absolutely positive that I had closed it, in an effort to keep the bugs out. I started second-guessing myself, until I reached the site. Instantly, I noticed that someone had definitely been there. Inside my tent, my bags were all ripped open and my clothes were scattered everywhere. I started panicking, hoping that they didn't take my purse. When I reached in to grab the bag my purse was in, I was shocked. Everything inside was still there, completely untouched. I felt a little relieved, but still freaked out, knowing that whoever it was had to have known I was staying there and went through my stuff. I looked around, but saw nothing. I decided that it would be dumb to stay, so I started packing up all of my stuff. My car was about a quarter mile away, parked in a dirt parking lot. My feet ached with every step, exhausted from my hike and the additional weight on my back. I walked down the sidewalk-sized dirt road with every intention of getting out of there fast. Just before I reached my car, I noticed a campsite that wasn't there previously. I saw a guy sitting on a log in front of a fire with a blank expression on his face. As soon as he saw me, he sat up really quickly and turned to the tent behind him. I was definitely startled that he got up so fast, and I didn't understand why he was acting so frantic. Once I got to my car, I opened the trunk to throw my stuff in before I heard someone yelling at me. I turned around to see that another guy had emerged out of the tent. Although it was dark, I could tell that they had long, unkempt beards. They shouted at me to wait, but I was too scared. I got in my car and drove off as fast as I could, all while watching them scream stuff at me through my rearview mirror. I have no idea where they came from, since my car was the only one in the parking lot. I even purposely picked a very desolate campsite to avoid running into any people. Looking back now, I'm so glad I left that night. I'm not sure why they decided to camp right by both my car and my campsite. It definitely wasn't a coincidence. They knew where I was the whole time, and that terrifies me. If I hadn't left that campsite, who knows what would have happened to me.
I work at a pizza shop on the weekends, just outside of Jackson County, Florida. It's a small, family-owned business that does really well, since they're the only pizza shop around. It's a pretty small town, but I make great money as a driver, especially for only working on the weekends. A few months ago, I was out doing deliveries on a Saturday night. It had been pouring all night, and I kept getting flash flood warnings on my phone, but the orders were coming in non-stop, so I was pretty much the man of the hour. Being the only driver for the night, I had zero downtime from the start of my shift. It was around 11 o'clock, and I had just gotten back from a delivery. As soon as I walked inside, another box was sitting on the counter, all ready to go. Without taking any time, I grabbed the box and walked out to my car. I was in a great mood that night, making almost double the money I'd usually make. I punched the address into my Google Maps and started heading there. It was only 15 minutes away, and I remember delivering to this house once or twice before. When I was about 5 minutes away, I turned down a long stretch of road that sat between fields of crops on one side and houses on the other. So, as I was making my way down this road, I spotted a car that appeared to be broken down on the side by the cornfields. Although it was hard to see with all the rain on the windows of my car, I was able to make out a male figure standing by the hood. I slowed down, trying not to completely soak him as I passed. But as I neared him, he sat down in the puddle by the road and buried his head between his knees. It seemed like he was pretty upset, so the good person inside me decided to pull over to see if I could help him out. I threw on my hazards and pulled up on the side of the road, just in front of his car. Trying not to get soaked, I quickly got out and ran over to him and asked if he was alright. He didn't respond to me at all, but looked up at me with a really weird smile, almost like it was fake. I repeated myself, thinking he must not have heard me, but again, he just held this really creepy grin. I was instantly weirded out, so I turned to walk back to my car. Just as I got in, I heard a loud thump and felt my entire car shake, followed by a loud scream. The guy had jumped on top of my car and was pounding on the roof. It all happened so fast and was all totally unexpected. Before I knew it, the guy had jumped down from my car and was pounding at the driver's side window with a knife. I only saw him for a brief second, but he had a look of madness on his face. Terrified, I started my car, but just before I was about to put it in drive, the guy had punched through the glass with his knife, narrowly missing my head. I screamed, flooring it out of there, not even thinking about the chances of hydroplaning off the road. Thankfully, I made it a pretty good distance down the road, and I picked up my phone to call the police. As I was on the phone with the operator, I saw a woman holding a baby, walking down the side of the road with her sweater pulled over each of their heads. I instantly thought back to the car, so I rolled down the window next to her and asked if that was her car that broke down a couple miles back. She said yes, so I asked her if she knew who that guy was. She looked at me with a dumbfounded look, then replied, "What guy?" I quickly explained everything to her, then showed I was on the phone with the police. I offered to take her to a gas station down the road to get further away, and also to get them out of the rain, so she agreed and got in with her baby. We drove a couple more miles down the road until we pulled into a gas station and waited for the police. When one of the cops arrived, he took down our information and I gave him my statement. They told us they'd check it out and let us know if anything comes up. By now, I was already 40 minutes late to my delivery, but I still decided to drop it off anyway, since I was only a couple minutes away. I called my boss and told him what had happened, telling him that I was done for the night after this drop-off. I went home that night with a busted driver's side window, a scratched-up car, and a ton of fear, but I was happy that I didn't get killed by that psycho. I assumed he was on drugs, but I'm not sure. It's been the only reasonable conclusion I could come up with. I heard back the next morning from the police that the guy was gone by the time they arrived, which was really unfortunate to hear. I'm not sure where that guy came from, or if he's still out there in those fields, but I hope he's eventually caught. I'd like to think that my family and I are always prepared when it comes to keeping the house safe. We live in a pretty safe area, where crime isn't much of an issue, but we'd like to think that we could have just about everything anyone could ever need in the case of a dangerous situation. My husband has been with the police force for almost the past 2 decades, so naturally, he's insistent about keeping our home secure. We have several guns that we keep in a couple different spots throughout the house, along with our retired police dog, Apollo. So, as you can imagine, we all feel pretty safe. My husband had been put on nights for the past couple weeks to fill in for his buddy, who was out of commission for a couple months after undergoing a medical procedure. On this night, I was home alone with my 6-year-old daughter, Gia. I had put her to sleep around 9:30, and I was in the living room watching TV with Apollo as the rain poured outside. To keep him healthy, I've always tried to walk him as much as possible, even if it was just for a little bit. At some point, the rain had slowed down to a drizzle, so I decided I'd take him for a quick walk to the end of the street to burn off some energy before bed. I grabbed Apollo's leash as he squealed with excitement, and we made our way outside. Once we made it a couple houses down, Apollo started barking like crazy in the direction of our neighbor's backyard. I tried to get him to stop, but it seemed like no matter how hard I tried, he wouldn't give it up. Our neighbors have a pretty big backyard, about the same size as ours, so I was under the impression that either the neighbor was outside or there was just an animal roaming around. We kept walking, but as we continued on, Apollo kept turning back and looking towards the neighbor's house. He was starting to freak me out, given his experience in the police force, so I turned around to head back home shortly after. I was relieved to see that Apollo wasn't barking anymore as we passed the neighbor's backyard on the way back, after probably waking up the entire neighborhood. When we got back inside the house, I laid back down on the couch, and Apollo went about his normal business, drinking water and eating from his food bowl in the kitchen. I guess I ended up passing out on the couch, because I was awakened at some point in the night to Apollo growling. It took me a second to wake up, until I heard him growling again. I rubbed my eyes, and checked my phone to see that it was 1:30 a.m. I muted the TV, trying to figure out what his deal was, until I realized he was upstairs. Any fatigue I felt before that was instantly gone, and I ran up to go check it out. When I found Apollo, he was standing in one of the guest bedrooms, growling at the window. His hair was spiked up along his back, so something definitely spooked him. I looked out the window, trying to figure out what he saw, but there was nothing. The window faces towards the garage, which is connected on a lower level to the upstairs of the house, so all I could really see was the roof of the garage. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but I definitely felt worried, since it was now the second time he'd been growling at seemingly nothing. I sat down on the bed, trying to pet him so he'd calm down. Shortly after, I got up to go to my room and hopefully fall back asleep, leaving Apollo alone in the guest bedroom. Within seconds after my head hit the pillow in bed, Apollo started going crazy. Startled, I flew out of bed to see what he was barking at, but once again, I still couldn't figure out why. That's when I heard a loud thump. It seemed like it came from outside, but it sounded close. That set Apollo off again, and I started to get worried that something was seriously wrong. Apollo's barking and growling woke up Gia in her room, which was directly behind the guest bedroom. She yelled for me, and I quickly ran in, followed by Apollo. She was obviously freaked out, and I tried to calm her down, but Apollo would not stop barking. This time, he was facing Gia's window, which also pointed towards the garage. Beyond being confused and startled, I got up to pull back the curtains on Gia's window, and what I saw on the other side made me scream and almost fall back. There was a masked person standing on top of our garage, looking through the window, with both hands pressed up against it. By this point, I was screaming, Gia was screaming, and Apollo was practically foaming at the mouth. As soon as the person saw me, they disappeared, where I assumed that they jumped off the roof of the garage. I ran back into my room and grabbed the 12-gauge shotgun from under the bed and called the police. Also wanting to alert my husband, I got off the phone after giving dispatch the address, and I called him. He works in a district over, but told me he was on his way when he heard the chaos in the background. Well, shortly after, the police arrived, followed by my husband, who showed up in his patrol car. They searched the entire property for the suspect, but he was gone. It was determined that he used our trash cans on the side of the house to climb up on the garage. As they continued investigating, they found that there was no apparent sign of breaking and entering, and the locks to the doors remained undamaged. However, footprints were found in our backyard that led through several of our neighbors, including the backyard of the house that Apollo was barking at. The worst part of all is that we still have no idea who it was, or what they were trying to do. My husband and I, along with the police, have a strong feeling that it was someone we knew. The fact that they were standing right outside Gia's window in the middle of the night while my husband was working gives us all a sickening feeling. It certainly seemed to be planned out to an extent, meaning that they would have had to observe our routines beforehand in order to pick the time where they'd be least likely to get caught. I'm not sure if we'll ever find out, and unfortunately, we still live in fear. We're now extra cautious of any adults being around Gia, and we've since added a home security system. If we didn't have Apollo, I can't even begin to imagine what would have happened to my daughter, given that I was sleeping on the couch in the living room. Who knows? Maybe it was just a freak coincidence, and a random person decided to try to break in through my daughter's window, but I have a bad feeling that it wasn't. This story happened quite a while ago, but it's something that'll always be imprinted in my mind. In the second half of 1998, I had taken a job as a security guard at a plant that made locks. I usually worked one of 3 shifts, either 4 p.m. to 12 a.m., 7:30 p.m. to 3:30 a.m., or 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. The 7:30 to 3:30 shift was for extra coverage, so there were always 2 of us there from 7:30 to midnight. It was a routine, boring job for the most part. We did our rounds, logged anything out of the ordinary, and watched a tiny monitor displaying the CCTV feed. Things went by in an almost painfully normal manner for 6 months. I worked, saved up, bought a car, and planned to move. By late March of 1999, I served my notice and prepared to head cross-country. A new hire was brought in to fill my spot. He was a soft-spoken man named Calvin. As part of his training, Calvin spent time working at all hours. At night, he was a shadow, working with myself and the other night guard, getting a feel for the plant's nocturnal routines. Most nights, he worked with myself and Amira, a female guard who was around my age. I was 18 at the time. Calvin, who was about a decade older, was quiet and polite, though something seemed to be missing with him. There's a spark that genuinely nice people seem to have, and he didn't possess it. Whenever he went on rounds with me, he'd ask questions about the job and make small talk. I noticed that he was a little odd, laughing at odd times and changing his tone mid-sentence. At the time, I just chalked it up to him being awkward, but that wouldn't last. One night, near the end of his first week, he went on rounds with Amira. When they returned to the office, I knew something was wrong. Normally talkative, Amira barely said a word. Not sure what had occurred, I waited until Calvin had gone to the restroom to ask. She explained that during their trip, everything had been normal until they reached the brass mill, a portion of the plant that shut down at 6 p.m. There were usually no employees there after that time, and no lights. They were making their way to a checkpoint on a landing atop a flight of stairs when the mood shifted. She told me that she turned around, only to find that he was standing inches away from her. Startled, she backed up against the grating at the end of the landing, and he leaned in towards her, his face nearly touching hers. He flirted with her in a low and creepy voice. Freaked out, she told him to stop and mention his wedding band, in which he replied, saying that it would be over soon. From then on, I did the rounds, taking Calvin with me each time. The night ended without further incident, and I left a note for our supervisor detailing what had occurred. Well, the next night came, and there was no Calvin. I did the rounds, while Amir stayed in the locked office. This continued for several nights, and Calvin had seemingly dropped off the face of the planet. Then, on my second to last shift, I came in to find her freaking out. When I asked what was wrong, she said she found out why Calvin hadn't been at work. He had been arrested for murdering his wife. She had been dismembered and burned, and parts of her body were placed in a pond less than a mile from where we worked. That night and the next, Amir called the jail just to make sure they were still holding him. Based on the time frame, he had killed his wife months before he started the job. It was the week before Valentine's Day, and I was feeling optimistic about the prospects of finding someone special to celebrate it with. I had been single now for a few months, but I was ready to get back out there and find someone who I could really connect with. I decided to try my luck online and see if I could find a potential match. After doing some research, I signed up for some of the most popular dating sites and created my profiles. Within a few days, I had gotten a few messages from potential matches. One message in particular stood out to me. It was from a guy who had sent me a message asking me out for Valentine's Day. He told me his name was Josh and that he was a really successful attorney. He said he had recently rented a cabin in the woods outside of town and wanted to know if I'd be interested in joining him for dinner there on Valentine's Day. I was a little hesitant at first, but decided to give it a try. After all, what did I have to lose? I agreed to meet him at the cabin at 6 p.m. On Valentine's Day, I arrived at the cabin a few minutes early. Before I got out, I texted my best friend, telling her that I arrived at the date, even though she had my location that I shared with her. She forced me to make a deal with her that if I didn't text her every hour, then she'd call the police and come there. I agreed, knowing that she had my best intentions in mind. I was feeling a little nervous, but mostly excited. I took a deep breath and got out of the car. I knocked on the door, and after a few seconds, Josh opened it. He was even better looking in person. He gave me a warm smile and welcomed me inside. The cabin was beautiful. It was a large, 2-story log cabin with a cozy living room and a beautiful fireplace. Josh had set the table for 2 and had prepared an incredible dinner. We had a great conversation and really connected. I still kept in touch with my best friend each hour and told her it was going really well. By the time dinner was over, it was almost 9 p.m. Josh suggested that we should take a walk and explore the area. I was hesitant at first, but he assured me that it would be safe. He seemed so sincere and so trustworthy, so I agreed. On the way there, my friend texted me, asking me why my location was moving out into the woods. I responded with laughing emojis and told her I was fine, but she seemed nervous. She asked me to update her in 10 minutes just to be safe, and although a bit annoyed, I agreed. We continued walking until we eventually reached a clearing in the woods. Josh told me that he had something special planned for us. He asked me to close my eyes, and when I opened them again, I saw that he had set up a picnic blanket and had brought a bottle of champagne. The area overlooked the snow-covered mountains, and it was a beautiful sight to say the least. At first, I was touched by his romantic gesture, but then I noticed something strange. He had a camera set up on a tripod, pointed directly at us. I asked him what it was for, but he just smiled and said it was part of the surprise. He had a pretty goofy sense of humor to him, so I didn't put it past him. As soon as we sat down, I mentioned to him that I was already cold, but he reassured me and said we'd only be out for a few minutes. Josh popped the champagne open and poured 2 glasses for us. Before handing it to me, he pointed out to the other side of the mountain and said he camped up there earlier that winter with his buddies, so he was used to the freezing temperatures. I was impressed, knowing I wouldn't last out there for more than an hour. After talking about it some more, he handed me the glass, and we made a toast and started drinking. The time flew by, and before I knew it, it had already been 15 minutes past the time I was supposed to text my friend. As soon as I reached for my phone, I began to feel lightheaded, and my head started spinning in circles. I heard Josh saying something to me, but his voice sounded echoey and slurred. Before I knew it, I opened my eyes, instantly feeling a raging headache as a bright light was shining above my eyes. It blinded me to the point where all I could see was white, until my eyes finally started to adjust and I could make out my surroundings. I was in a hospital. I instantly started freaking out and screaming. A doctor came running into the room and explained everything to me. I was in absolute disbelief and shock. Tears formed in my eyes. She told me that I'd been drugged. I had so many questions, but I didn't even know where to start. That's when the doctor walked out of the room and my best friend came running in. She was also in tears and embraced me in the tightest hug. It turns out, Josh drugged my champagne while he was distracting me. He carried me all the way back to the cabin, until he saw my friend's car parked in the driveway. He dropped me on the ground and took off running. My friend called an ambulance and had me rushed to the emergency room. The police know who he is, and there's a warrant out for his arrest. We're just hoping that it's just a matter of time before he's caught. I still live in fear each day, knowing he's out there somewhere, with the entire happening recorded on his camera. This night really changed my perspective on people. I always thought I had a great judgment of character, but I was terribly wrong. My best friend saved my life that day, and I'll forever be grateful. It was a typical day at the office. I had been working at this accounting firm for the past 3 years, and every day felt like a grind. I sat at my cubicle with the same paperwork I had been going over for the past hour and a half. I was exhausted, but I knew that I needed to finish this task if I wanted to get out of the office. It was Valentine's Day, and I had no plans. I was single, and had been for quite some time. I developed a bit of a crush on one of my coworkers, but I had never worked up the courage to say anything to him. I had been hoping he might make the first move, but so far he hadn't. As 5 o'clock approached, I was getting ready to call it a day when I noticed a letter sitting on my desk. I hadn't seen it there before, but it was addressed to me. I was intrigued and immediately opened it up. It was a short note that said, "Let's go out tonight, 8 p.m., I'll drive." Then, at the bottom right-hand corner of the letter was an address to his house. I was confused and a little scared. I guess it was kind of weird. It could have been anyone, but I assumed it was from my coworker, given that he was the only person I really talked to. As I drove home, I started to put the pieces of the puzzle together. He'd always go out of his way to talk to me, and he'd always compliment me at work. I had a pretty good feeling that it was from him, so I decided to take a chance and go to his house. I arrived at 8 p.m. sharp and got out of my car to ring the doorbell. I waited there in suspense, excited to see my secret admirer from work. I soon heard footsteps approaching the door, until it swung wide open. It was a man I'd never seen before. He had a look of excitement on his face, as he shook my hand and introduced himself as Mason. I think he noticed the bewildered look on my face, because he quickly said that he was the janitor, and added that I've probably never seen him before. I certainly hadn't, and I instantly felt uncomfortable. Without giving much thought beforehand, I told him that I was sorry and that I had to go. That was when I noticed the look on his face. He was furious. I apologized again, and quickly started walking to my car, as he screamed profanities at me. I was genuinely terrified, not expecting any of this to happen. I drove back to my apartment as fast as I could, constantly looking behind me to make sure he wasn't following me. Once I was confident enough that he wasn't, I turned into my complex and parked. Once I got inside, I had a sick feeling in my stomach that lasted the entire night. The way he reacted when I left his house scared me to death, and I knew I'd be in danger if he really worked in my office building. Well, the next day, I made sure to arrive at work a little late, trying to minimize my chances of running into him alone. As soon as I saw my boss, I asked to speak with him and sat down across from him at his desk. I explained everything to him, mentioning how the letter turned out to be from a man who claimed to be Mason. When I told this to my boss, his expression drastically changed to a worried look. He told me that he was hired yesterday and immediately fired on the first day of the job. He was in desperate need of another janitor because the previous one had recently quit, so he hired Mason. He realized that he fabricated his resume when the background check came back. It wasn't good. Mason had 3 ongoing criminal trials. 2 were for assault on women, and the 3rd was for armed robbery. When I heard that, I lost all composure and broke down crying. I was just feet away from him, alone at night, and I didn't tell anybody where I was going. Months later, I found out that Mason was guilty of all 3 accounts, and the crimes committed were horrible and disgusting. Looking back on everything now, I can't help but feel sheer regret. I made an impulsive decision to meet at the address, and it almost cost me my life. He pleaded guilty to each crime, so I realized that he knew he was already facing a lot of prison time, and most likely had something horrible planned with me that night. I used to love Valentine's Day. It's a day that's dedicated to celebrating love and happiness. In the past, I've normally spent the day out with my friends, going out to restaurants and exchanging gifts, but this year was different. I had found someone special, or at least I thought. His name was Zach. We started talking on Instagram when he sent me a nice message. Within days, we exchanged phone numbers and were texting all the time, and I was really starting to like him. I almost felt like it was moving too fast, but it strangely felt natural. I felt like I had known him my entire life. The time flew by, and before I knew it, I realized that we chatted every day for at least 2 hours for the entire month. Although everything felt perfect, it wasn't. Zach lived in Florida, and I live in Texas. It wasn't ideal by any means, since we were both in school and would rarely have time to visit each other in person. Despite the difficult circumstances, Zach asked me out on the phone on Valentine's Day, and I said yes. I had been lonely for so long, and I finally felt like I found the one for me. Right before I hung up the phone, he told me that he sent a package that would be arriving that night. The hours leading up to that moment were full of anticipation. I was already super happy that we were dating, and was beyond excited to see what he got for me. That night, he texted me, telling me that the package was delivered and to go check the front door. I took no time to hesitate, so I got up to check. My jaw almost dropped to the ground when I saw a giant cardboard box sitting on my front porch. I couldn't believe it. I struggled as I dragged the box into my living room and grabbed a knife to cut it open. There, inside the massive box, was a giant teddy bear. It was the cutest thing I'd ever seen. My first thought was how thoughtful he was to have sent it all the way from his hometown to me. I was completely shocked, and I immediately picked it up and hugged it tight against my chest. I smiled to myself, feeling so lucky to have such an amazing boyfriend who cared about me. I carried it into my room and plopped him down on the bed next to me. I spent the rest of the night talking on the phone with Zach, talking and laughing with him the entire time. Up until this point, I never had the slightest feeling that anything was off with Zach, but that started to change when he called me just before I went to bed. Our conversation started off just like any other, and we chatted for a few minutes before he asked me if I wanted to play a game. I was kind of thrown off by the question, but I agreed, excited to see what he had planned. He explained how we'd ask each other questions, like what color is your room, and then we'd have to guess to see if we got it right. I started off by asking him what color my socks were, and he surprisingly guessed the color on the first try. They were blue. He asked me some questions, but I got most of them wrong. As it went on, I started growing suspicious of Zach. Although it didn't seem like it before, I was starting to get a weird feeling that something was off. Out of the several questions I asked him, he had gotten every single one right. I asked him about it in a joking manner, and he replied saying that he just knew, and added that he feels really connected with me. It was a sweet thing to say, but something about it was rubbing me the wrong way, so I told him I was going to sleep since I had to be up early. I didn't want to automatically pass it off as something creepy. I guess a part of me was a little worried that we really did have that strong of a connection, and like I said before, it felt like it was all happening so fast. I've always struggled with anxiety, so I calmed myself down as I realized that I was just overreacting. The teddy bear was great for that, so I cuddled up with it in bed and fell asleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up to use the bathroom. I'm a light sleeper, and I usually wake up at least once or twice during the night. As soon as I came back to my room, I thought I saw a strange red blinking light coming from the teddy bear. I wiped my eyes and crawled back into bed, assuming I was just seeing things, given that I was half asleep. I pulled the teddy bear closer so that we were face to face, and I shut my eyes. Then, it happened again. This time, I was almost positive that I wasn't seeing things. My eyes fully opened, and I laid there, frozen, waiting for it to happen again to confirm my suspicions. And sure enough, I saw it. There was a light inside the left eye that would blink every 10 seconds or so. My groggy state quickly turned into a full-out panic attack. I ran out of my room and straight into the kitchen, where I grabbed the knife and began cutting into it. I was desperately hoping for it to be some sort of misunderstanding, until I cut through the fabric beneath the eye. It was a camera. I screamed, almost falling back into the kitchen table behind me. My mind was racing, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. Without even thinking, I grabbed the camera and threw it in the sink, and started soaking it under water. I truly had no idea what to do, so I called my best friend. She wasn't happy that I woke her up, but she quickly realized the situation I was in and told me that she'd be heading over right away. When she got there, she couldn't believe it was true. She tried to calm me down and eventually called the police. By the time they got to my house, I was covered in tears and shaking, as I kept thinking how he'd been watching me the entire day and night. The police searched for fingerprints on the bear and tore it apart for any other evidence, but the camera was all they had, which I had already destroyed. They asked for Zach's social media accounts and phone number, which I gave them. When they searched for him online, his accounts were all deleted. The phone number was deactivated, and the police were at a dead end. Well, it turns out, I wasn't the only victim. A month later, the detective on the case informed me that this was happening in other states, where 3 other women came to the police with an almost identical story. Looking back, I feel so stupid for ever getting myself into a long-distance relationship with someone I'd never even met in person. I still get sick, thinking that Zach, or whatever his real name was, still has the footage of me in my bedroom, which used to be one of the few places I felt safe. I could tell from the way my friends and family look at me that they feel sorry for my naivety, but I'm just grateful that I found everything out sooner than later. The person or persons involved have still not been caught, and I honestly don't feel safe in my house anymore. To start, I need to give a little background information first. I work for a marketing agency, so I'm often asked to travel to different states to help run and overlook meetings with clients. I started working for the company right when I got out of college, and I was hired along with several other new employees. I quickly became friends with another girl who worked there named Megan. We worked in the same branch, so we pretty much became best friends within the first couple weeks. Anyway, a few months passed, until our boss assigned me to go on a business trip with Megan to Houston, Texas. We had each done a few trips prior, but we never had the opportunity to go together. So, as you can imagine, we were both pretty excited to hear the news. We flew in on a Friday night for our meeting the next day. We took an Uber to the hotel once we got off the plane, sometime around 8:30. Shortly after getting dropped off and settling in, Megan suggested going out and exploring some of the bars in the area, since our meeting wasn't until 1 in the afternoon the next day. It was definitely a decision on impulse, but we took an Uber to a little area that had a few bars along the street. The night started off great, and we were making great conversation with a few new faces, even playing some pool together. As the night went on, I started to reach my limit, so I really held back on the drinking. Just around that time, a couple other girls asked if we wanted to go to a different bar, so we agreed and followed them out. Most of the bars were pretty packed, but we found one maybe a half-mile down the street that wasn't too crowded. As soon as we walked inside, I realized why. The inside looked to be at least 30 or 40 years older than the other bars around, and the entire place looked run down and dingy. A few of us sat down at a table, but Megan stayed by the bar with another girl, continuing to drink. She's even smaller than me, and I know for a fact that she doesn't drink often. She was starting to act a little out of control, so I got up and told her that we should head back. I don't think she was really able to comprehend anything I said, because she sort of just laughed and went back to drinking. Knowing that she was clearly way too drunk, I ordered an Uber to pick us up and take us back to the hotel. Well, not even a minute after I set it up, she stood up, almost falling over, saying that she didn't feel good. I grabbed her by the arm and attempted to lead her to the bathroom, but the door was locked. I helped her stand up against the wall until they got out, but she started gagging. The back door was only a few feet away, and it was my only other option, so I pulled her out to the parking lot behind the bar in case she got even more sick. There were a couple dumpsters near the back of the parking lot, so I took her over there and sat her down against the fence. She sat there on the ground, hunched over for a few minutes, until I noticed a man walking around the side of the building. He was smoking a cigarette, so it didn't really strike me as anything strange. I tried talking to Megan to see how she was doing, but she couldn't even form proper sentences. I was upset at her for getting this drunk, so my only thought was getting her back to the hotel to lay down as soon as possible. I checked on the Uber and saw that our driver was 5 minutes away. I relayed the information over to Megan, but she didn't respond at all. Just then, I heard footsteps that sounded to be getting closer. I turned my head over my shoulder and saw that the guy was walking directly towards us. When we made eye contact, he jokingly said, "Your friend all right?" I sort of laughed and said, "Not really, but she'll be fine." Instead of saying anything back like I expected, he continued to walk closer to us. When he was within a couple feet away from us, he bent over towards Megan, putting his hands on his knees, and said, "You all right, honey?" Megan was obviously unresponsive to that, but instead of saying anything to me or walking away, he just stood there staring at her. That's when I started getting uncomfortable. Between being in an unfamiliar city and now this random guy staring at Megan in the back of the parking lot, I was starting to get pretty worried. I tried to think of something to say, so I told the guy that our Uber was just a minute away and thanked him for checking on us. He turned his head towards me for the first time since he walked over and said, "No, you shouldn't get in a car when she's like this. The Uber driver will kick you out." I nervously laughed and said we'll take our chances, but this guy only became more and more creepy. He took another step towards Megan and started running his fingers through her hair. I told him to stop, but his somewhat calm demeanor became very aggressive. He told me he was just trying to help her out, but it was clear to me that he had other intentions. When I tried to pull Megan away, he pushed me up against the fence and told me not to test him. That's when I really started freaking out. Once he turned away from me, he set his sights on Megan and told her to get up. She was completely out of it, having no idea what was going on. I screamed at her to get away from him, but she sort of just rolled over to the side on the ground. That was when I made her run for the bar. I didn't bother looking back, and I just assumed he was chasing me, but when I opened the door, I looked back to see that he had his arms around Megan. I started screaming in the bar and yelling for help, and I quickly gathered everyone's attention. A couple guys who were talking to the bartender turned to me and asked what was wrong. I showed them out to the back where the guy now had Megan over his shoulder, attempting to carry her. The two guys yelled at him and charged at him. When the guy saw they were coming after him, he dropped Megan on the cement and hopped the fence to get away. One of the guys hopped the fence and followed after him, but shortly returned out of breath. He got away. One of the bystanders called the police, and within minutes, 2 cop cars had arrived in the parking lot. I explained everything to them, trying not to stumble over my words. An ambulance arrived minutes later for Megan, and I ended up riding in the back with her to the hospital. Other than a few scrapes and bruises, she was ultimately okay. I laid down on the bench just outside her room, barely sleeping a wink. When she woke up the next morning, she wasn't able to recall anything that happened. 2 police officers visited us in her room to ask Megan a few questions, but she was no help. The videos captured on the bar security camera were no help either. The imaging was apparently too dark and blurry, so they had no way of identifying the man. It was confirmed that the guy had never entered the bar, so it's assumed that he spotted us as he was walking by. I ended up attending the meeting the next day without Megan, and my boss was not happy when he found out. We thankfully made it back home safe and sound, but it easily could have turned out so much worse. Megan has thanked me multiple times and has definitely learned her lesson, but it still haunts me, knowing that I was just seconds away from potentially losing my best friend for good. Every year, my family and I go to Florida in the summer for vacation. My wife and I like to travel to different parts of the state each time, so this year, we had our sights set on Key West. We booked a condo that sat inside its own little gated community that was just a short walk away from the ocean. This year, we decided to buy a rental car and drive, just to do a little sightseeing on the way. My wife and I enjoyed the long road trip, but our 5-year-old son, Elliot, was not a fan at all. After countless "are we there yets" and constant complaining, we finally made the 14-hour car drive and arrived at our condo. As we pulled into the complex, we had to pass through a security post, making sure that everyone that was entering was a resident. I was certainly happy to see that, giving my wife and I a sense of ease, knowing that we picked a safe spot for the week. Once we picked up the keys at the office, we drove down the beautiful resort roads to our condo, passing tons of happy families. Our condo complex is beautiful. It was a smaller building, only 2 stories, but the exterior of the building looked brand new. It almost resembled the shape of a huge wooden cabin, with freshly painted wood and palm trees surrounding the property. Our room was on the 2nd floor, with a balcony that overlooked a huge pond in the backyard. It was everything we ever could have asked for and more. We went to bed pretty early that night, in preparation for the big week ahead. We had planned to drive around the city in the morning to check it out, get something to eat, then spend the rest of the day at the ocean. After finding a few promising restaurants and tourist attractions to explore later in the week, we headed back to our condo to go to the beach. After soaking up some sun, it was almost time for dinner, so we went to the shoreside hotel to get some food at the restaurant. Everything seemed completely normal up until this point, but that soon changed shortly after we entered the hotel. We entered through the oceanside door, which was right by the restaurant. The inside had an open room layout, where everything was kind of merged together in one big room. We picked a table overlooking the ocean, so I really didn't pay much attention to the inside, as my eyes were drawn to the ocean scenery. Within minutes after sitting down, my wife, who was sitting across from me, started muttering my name under her breath. I looked at her, confused, until she shifted her eyes across the room to a bench where a bald man was sitting, staring directly at us. I found it strange, but sort of laughed it off, telling my wife I didn't know what his deal was. I sort of forgot about it, until I eventually got up to use the restroom. As I was walking to the bathroom, I was able to get a better view of the man. He was wearing a red t-shirt tucked into a pair of beige khakis. He gave no notice to me as I walked past, almost like he was frozen. It seemed really odd, so I turned back to look again, realizing that he was staring directly at my wife and Elliot. Instead of going into the bathroom, I decided to walk back to the table, where I told my wife we were leaving. I asked Elliot if he'd like to get pizza delivered, and he excitedly responded with a yes as he skipped around the sidewalk heading back to our condo. My wife and I were relieved to get out of there, as we both had a strange feeling about that man. Anyway, the pizza eventually came, and we ate inside as we all watched a movie together. Given that I did the majority of the driving on the way there, the lack of sleep I had the other night was catching up to me. I went to bed pretty early, while my wife and Elliot hung out in the living room. Not too long after passing out, I heard the door to the condo shut. It freaked me out a bit, so I got up to check. As I looked around, neither my wife or Elliot were there. Starting to panic, I ran into my room and checked my phone, and was relieved to see a text from my wife explaining why they left. Her and Elliot were going to the pool for a little bit for a night swim. Our complex had its own private pool, away from the main pool next to the hotel by the ocean, so I deemed it to be a generally safe area. Within a half hour of reading my wife's text, I received a disturbing call from her. "Hey, someone's been standing at the front gate watching us." I shot up in bed after hearing that. Her voice sounded calm, but shaky, and I knew she was freaked out. I told her I was on my way, so I slipped on my shoes and made my way there. To get to the pool, you have to cross a bridge that goes over a pond, then the pool is on the right side. As soon as I made it to the bridge, I could instantly see that there indeed was the shadow of a person leaned up against the fence looking at the pool. As I got closer, I felt myself break a sweat, as I realized that it was the same bald man from earlier. As soon as he heard my footsteps approaching, he instantly turned and began walking away. Finding it hard to be a coincidence, I decided to follow him to see what he was up to. I was maybe 25 feet behind him, but I think he knew, because as soon as he saw me following him, he picked up the pace. I followed him back to another complex, before he turned the corner and was out of sight. I tried running to see where he went, but as soon as I turned the corner, he was gone. Although it was definitely creepy, I was just glad that he was gone. Once I made it back to the pool, we all walked back to our room together. I could tell that my wife was visibly shaken up, but it eventually slipped our minds and we went to sleep. The next day, we spent a lot of time at the beach again, before going to a fancy seafood restaurant for dinner. We had a great day, but the sun had us drained, and we were all exhausted. As soon as we pulled up to the parking lot to go inside, we immediately knew that something was wrong. There were tons of police cars outside the complex across from us, with a group of bystanders watching from the parking lot of our condo. I got out of the car to ask the bystanders if they knew what happened, and one guy responded. He said that it looks like someone tried to kidnap a child, but the father attacked him and was able to stop him. I asked if he saw what the guy looked like, and he said, "It's hard to see this far away, but he was bald." It didn't take long for me to put two and two together. I ran back to the room, shocked, and told my wife what the guy just told me. We were both in disbelief, and she broke down crying, thinking back to the night before, when they were alone at the pool. Had my phone ringer not been on and I didn't show up, it wouldn't have been good, knowing that Elliot and my wife could have been his victims. I had just moved to Southern California for college. My roommate and I, both males in our early 20s, thought it would be fun to drive into Mexico because it was only a couple hours away and we'd never been there before. We decided to go on a Saturday morning and take a trip out there. Once we made it to Tijuana around 1 p.m., we parked and immediately hit a bar. We ate tacos and drank a lot of beer and tequila, so we weren't exactly sober at this point. After a couple hours, we exited onto the street, pretty drunk and in very good spirits. It was a pretty warm and sunny day, and there wasn't a single cloud in the sky. Our plan was to hang out a while longer, before making the drive back home at dusk once we sobered up enough. As we were walking around outside, we were approached on the street by a very friendly Hispanic male. He was very short and stocky, maybe 5'2" and approximately in his 30s. He was literally dressed like Lewis from Revenge of the Nerds, wearing a white dress shirt buttoned up all the way and tucked in, with hiked up trousers and a pair of sunglasses. He was very friendly and presented himself as a tour guide, offering to show us around the local spots. Although he gave off a friendly first impression, we politely declined his offer. I did notice that although he was dressed up kind of like a stereotypical nerd, he had some pretty hardcore tattoos on his neck. It didn't necessarily make us scared of him, but we just didn't care for his service. We kept walking, and eventually ended up in a busy part of town with a lot of people, so we really were not concerned about him at all. He kept on following us around, trying to chit-chat about the best bars and clubs. I guess it just seemed like he was a promoter or something. We were just kind of aimlessly walking around, and he began to recommend different spots for us to check out, which we mostly disregarded. Slowly, it seemed like we were walking more into the outskirts of town unknowingly. I don't remember how this exactly happened, but he was able to finally get us interested in a bar. He pointed it out and said it was the best one around, so I guess between the idea of the bar and his overall relentlessness, that's where we ended up going. Oddly, we couldn't even get inside because my roommate didn't have his ID on him. We ultimately walked away from this place, and the follower began to ask if we had any interest in drugs, and he rattled off the names of a few. This was the first time he had mentioned drugs. Like an idiot, I said I was interested. He told us to follow him, where he then led us towards a nearby bar, which was now really on the outskirts of town. On the walk over, my roommate quietly asked me what the hell I was doing buying drugs from this guy, but we continued. I told him it was fine, but I realized now that I was not in good judgment. We walked into this run-down 2-story bar, and he told my roommate to wait by one of the bar stools. He and I walked into the bathroom, where he asked me what I wanted and how much. I said $20 worth, which is all the money I had on me. I gave him the 20, and the bathroom door opened shortly thereafter. Some other random guy came in and gave the tour guide a small bag of drugs, which he then gave to me. I looked at it quickly and it seemed legit, so I put it in my pocket. I was ready to get out of the bathroom, but the guy was kind of in my way, so I made a move to pass him and say thank you. As I did this, he said something like, "Hold on a second, what about the $20 you owe me?" I said I already gave it to him, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pathetic crumpled up $1 bill and said, "Nah, you just gave me $1. That's when I knew I was in big trouble. I told him I didn't have any more money, which was true, but he was insistent. As we were standing there, the bathroom door flew open and my roommate walked in and began to use the urinal on the other side from us. I felt relieved seeing that he was nearby. The tour guide then asked me, "Does your friend have money?" I told him I didn't know. The tour guide then suggested that we should go to the ATM. I agreed, not really having another option, and told my roommate to follow us. We were now back on the street in daylight, following him to an ATM. My roommate didn't understand what was going on, but I was whispering to him to give me $20. He was confused, but started suspecting that something weird was going down. We were getting back into a part of town with more people on the streets, which was comforting. I kept asking my roommate to just give me $20 so I can get this guy off our back. He finally handed me a 20, just as we were nearing an ATM. I turned confidently to the tour guide, partly because there were more people around now, and gave him the 20 with a remark like, "There you go, please stop following us." He immediately grabbed the $20 and shoved it into his pocket, instantly demanding more money. We began walking away from him in another direction, but towards a populated shopping area. He stuck right behind us and started making threats, until he grabbed my right wrist where I had a watch that cost about $150. I wrenched my arm away from him, and we kept walking at a brisk pace, now with a lot of people around. I quickly took the watch off and put it in my cargo shorts pocket. We passed by a market, where 2 Hispanic males exited in front of us as we passed them. The tour guide yelled to them, speaking to them briefly. Before we knew it, all 3 men were suddenly running at us. They got a hold of me and pinned me to the wall of the sidewalk, where the tour guide pressed a big ballpoint pen to my neck. One of the guys began looking for the watch, but I stopped him and simply retrieved it to give to him. Once this happened, they fought for it, and my roommate and I ran away. I looked back over my shoulder, and they were literally fighting each other for this watch. We got to our car, tossed the drugs, and drove back across the border safely.